Something is hiding under 15 miles of ice on a moon, 485 million miles from Earth. The ocean down there holds twice as much water as every ocean on this planet combined. It has been sitting in total darkness for billions of years, completely cut off from the sun, completely cut off from us. And in early 2026, scientists found something in the ice that changed the entire conversation. We are going to go through all of it: the cracked surface that shouldn't exist, the radiation belt that kills in minutes, the spider-shaped scar left by an eruption of liquid salt water, the spacecraft racing toward it right now, and the question that keeps scientists up at night. If you enjoy the journey, hit like and subscribe. New videos every week. The ocean is waiting. Let's begin. Picture the most beaten up, crater-covered rock you can imagine. That's what most moons look like. They spend billions of years getting hammered by asteroids, comets, and space debris. Every hit leaves a scar. Those scars pile up. The surface turns into a record of everything that ever hit it, stretching back to the beginning of the solar system. Now, picture a moon with almost none of that. That's Europa. From a distance, it looks like a white billiard ball someone drew on with a red marker. The surface is so smooth that scientists call it one of the flattest solid surfaces in the entire solar system. The tallest features on Europa rise only about 300 feet off the ground. 300 feet. That's shorter than the Chrysler Building in New York City. On a moon that is nearly the same size as Earth's own moon, that is almost impossible. And that smoothness is the first sign that something is very wrong, or very interesting, depending on how you look at it. Here's the problem. Space is violent. Rocks fly through the solar system constantly. Jupiter, the massive planet Europa orbits, has a gravitational field so strong it pulls in asteroids and comets from all directions. Europa should be absolutely covered in craters. Scientists have counted impacts on other moons and used those counts to estimate the age of surfaces. The more craters, the older the surface. Europa has almost none. The surface looks young. Some estimates put it between 40 million and 90 million years old. On a solar system scale, that's practically brand new. Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago. Europa's surface, according to the crater count, started fresh sometime around when dinosaurs still walked this planet. So, what happened to all the old craters? Something erased them. The surface is renewing itself. Something underneath is pushing up, melting the old ice and laying down fresh layers. The old scars get swallowed. The surface resets. Whatever is doing that has been doing it for millions of years without stopping. And that's when you start to understand why Europa is not just another frozen moon in the outer solar system. But here's where it gets strange. While the surface is smooth on a large scale, zoom in and it looks anything but calm. The entire surface is slashed with lines, thousands of them. Some stretch for thousands of miles across the ice. They cross each other, layer on top of each other, run in parallel rows like something dragged a comb across the surface from the inside. These aren't scratches from outside. They didn't come from impacts or passing debris. They came from below. The ice is cracking. Something underneath is pushing, pulling, stretching, and squeezing the entire frozen shell of this moon. The lines are the result. Scientists call them lineae, which is just the technical word for lines. Some of them glow with a faint reddish-brown color, stained by chemicals that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside. Here is what makes that detail alarming. Those chemicals didn't start on the surface. They came from underneath. Whatever is down there is pushing material up through cracks in the ice, staining the surface, and then freezing over again. The surface of Europa is not a dead, frozen wasteland sitting quietly in the cold. It is a lid, a 15-mile thick frozen lid sitting on top of something that is actively churning, cracking the ice from below, and leaving chemical fingerprints on everything it touches. And the closer you look at those lines, the more it seems like whatever is underneath is trying to get out. What exactly is pushing from below is the question that changes everything. And the answer, when scientists finally pieced it together, was bigger than almost anyone expected. Stand at the edge of a frozen lake in winter. press your boot against the ice. If the ice is thick enough, nothing happens. But if you press harder, or if the ice is under stress from temperature changes underground, you'll hear it. A deep groan, a sharp crack, then a fracture line shoots across the surface, faster than you can follow it with your eyes. Europa does that, constantly, on a scale that would cover an entire continent. The fractures on Europa are not random. Scientists have mapped them carefully, and the patterns they form tell a very specific story about what is happening underneath the ice. The lines don't just appear anywhere, they cluster, they align, they match the kind of stress patterns you would expect to see if a thick shell of ice was being repeatedly squeezed, stretched, pulled sideways, and then released, over and over, for millions of years. The force doing all of that squeezing is Jupiter. Jupiter is the largest planet in the solar system. Its mass is more than 300 times the mass of Earth. When you orbit that close to something that enormous, the gravitational pull across the width of your own body is enormous. On one side, gravity pulls a little harder. On the other side, it pulls a little softer. That difference stretches the object being pulled. Scientists call this a tidal force. On Earth, tidal forces from the moon are what cause ocean tides. The water bulges slightly toward the moon and slightly away from it, and as the Earth rotates, that bulge moves around the surface. You experience it as the tide coming in and going out. On Europa, the same thing happens. Except Europa is made of ice, and ice doesn't flow the way water does. Europa doesn't orbit Jupiter in a perfect circle. Its path is slightly oval-shaped. That means sometimes Europa is closer to Jupiter, and sometimes it is farther away. When it gets closer, Jupiter's gravity pulls harder. The moon bulges. When it moves farther away, the pull loosens. The bulge relaxes. That bulge, rising and falling as Europa moves around its orbit, is about 100 feet tall. A wave of ice, rising and falling across the entire moon, every single time it completes an orbit. Europa orbits Jupiter once every 3.5 days. So that cycle repeats more than 100 times every Earth year. 100 times a year, the entire moon flexes. The ice can't handle that stress without breaking, so it cracks. The fractures we see on the surface are the physical record of that constant flexing. Every line is a place where the ice gave way under pressure that had been building for too long. But here's the part that scientists spent years working out. Some of the fracture patterns on Europa are ancient. They formed when Europa was in a slightly different position relative to Jupiter, and they don't match the current stress patterns. What that means is that Europa's icy shell has shifted. The entire outer layer of the moon has rotated, sliding independently over whatever is underneath it, like the loose skin of an orange, spinning slowly around the fruit inside. That should be impossible on a solid body. You can't rotate the outer shell of a rock independently from its core, unless the outer shell isn't attached to the core, unless there's something liquid in between. The fracture patterns on Europa's surface are not just cracks in ice. They are evidence. A map written in broken ice, pointing to an ocean hidden so deep that no light has ever touched it. And what that ocean looks like, how big it is, and what might be living in it is what the rest of this story is about. In October 1989, NASA launched a spacecraft called Galileo from the cargo bay of the Space Shuttle Atlantis. Its destination was Jupiter. The journey would take 6 years. When it finally arrived, it would change everything scientists thought they knew about the outer solar system. Galileo wasn't sent specifically to study Europa. Europa was one of many targets in the Jupiter system. But as the spacecraft began making close passes over the icy moon, something in the data kept pulling the science team's attention back. The magnetic field readings were strange. Jupiter produces one of the most powerful magnetic fields in the solar system. That field extends far out into space and wraps around everything in the Jupiter system, including its moons. When Galileo flew close to Europa and measured how that magnetic field behaved near the moon's surface, The readings didn't match what scientists expected. The magnetic field around Europa was being disrupted. Something inside the moon was pushing back against Jupiter's field, creating a secondary field of its own. On Earth, that kind of magnetic disruption happens for one reason: salt water. Electrically conductive liquid moving around generates its own magnetic response. A global ocean of salty water beneath Europa's ice would create exactly the magnetic signature Galileo was detecting, and it would have to be a global ocean covering the entire moon beneath the ice for the signal to appear the way it did. Scientists had suspected there might be liquid water under Europa before Galileo arrived. The surface fractures pointed to something fluid underneath, but the magnetic data made it real. It wasn't a guess anymore. There was an ocean down there. Galileo made 11 close passes over Europa over the course of its mission. With each pass, the data got sharper. The magnetic signal held up. Models were built to figure out how deep the ocean was, how thick the ice above it was, and what the water might contain. The numbers that came back were difficult to fully absorb. The ice shell above the ocean is estimated to be between 9 and 15 miles thick. Below that ice, the ocean stretches down for approximately 62 miles. 62 miles of liquid water sitting in complete darkness, sealed off from the sun by a frozen lid thicker than the state of Vermont is tall. The total volume of that water is roughly twice the volume of all the water in every ocean on Earth. Every Atlantic, every Pacific, every Arctic, every ocean our species has ever sailed, combined, and then doubled. All of it hidden under ice on a moon that most people have never heard of. And here is the detail that makes that fact feel heavier. Life on Earth appeared in the ocean. The very first living things on this planet didn't need sunlight. They didn't need air. They lived in water, fed on chemistry, and figured out how to exist before any of the conditions we think of as necessary for life were even present. If that happened in an ocean here, the question becomes immediate. Could it have happened in an ocean there? Galileo couldn't answer that. The spacecraft was designed to observe from a distance. It could detect the magnetic signature of an ocean. It couldn't see inside it, couldn't sample it, couldn't fly through it. The data pointed to the ocean's existence but left everything about its contents completely unknown. The mission ended in 2003 when scientists deliberately aimed Galileo at Jupiter and let the planet destroy it. They did that to protect Europa from contamination. And that decision, made over 20 years ago, tells you exactly how seriously scientists took what they had found. The ocean was real, and they weren't taking any chances with it. Close your eyes and try to picture all the water on Earth. Every ocean, every sea, every river and lake, every drop of rain falling somewhere right now, every glacier grinding slowly across Greenland, every aquifer buried under farmland in the middle of the country, every glass of water on every table in every city on the planet. All of that water together covers about 70% of Earth's surface. The Pacific Ocean alone is so wide that you could fit all the land on Earth inside it and still have room left over. The Mariana Trench, the deepest point in any ocean on this planet, drops down almost 7 miles below the surface. Earth is a water world. It is one of the wettest places we know of in the entire solar system. Europa has twice as much water, not twice as much visible water, not twice as much surface water, twice as much total water, all of it liquid, all of it hidden underneath 15 miles of ice on a frozen moon, almost 500 million miles from Earth. Let that sit for a moment. The ocean beneath Europa's surface has a volume of roughly 790 million cubic miles of water. The oceans of Earth contain about 320 million cubic miles. Europa's ocean is more than double that. If you could somehow drain all of Europa's ocean and pour it over Earth's surface, it would cover every continent, every mountain range, and every skyscraper on the planet under hundreds of feet of water. The Himalayas would vanish. The Empire State Building would disappear. The entire surface of Earth would become ocean, and there would still be water left to spare. And this water has been sitting there in the dark for billions of years. On Earth, every ocean on the surface gets stirred by wind. Currents driven by the sun's warmth carry warm water from the equator toward the poles and cold water back again. The ocean is never still. It's always mixing, always moving, always exchanging heat and chemistry between its layers. Europa's ocean is cut off from all of that. No wind, no sunlight, no weather. The only stirring comes from the tidal forces of Jupiter, flexing the moon from the outside and possibly from heat rising from the seafloor below. But here is the part that really matters. On Earth, in the very darkest parts of the ocean, miles below the sunlit surface where no photosynthesis has ever happened, life exists. It lives around hydrothermal vents where hot water loaded with minerals shoots up from cracks in the seafloor. Tube worms several feet long cluster around these vents. Shrimp with no eyes swarm in the mineral clouds. Bacteria thrive in conditions that would kill every surface-adapted creature instantly. These ecosystems run entirely on chemistry. No sun required, no photosynthesis, just heat, water, and dissolved minerals. Europa has water. Europa has heat, generated by Jupiter's tidal squeezing. And based on what scientists know about the seafloor, Europa may have minerals. Water, heat, minerals. Those are 3 of the 4 things scientists consider necessary for life to form. The 4th is time. And Europa has had billions of years. The ocean under that ice is vast enough to contain more unknowns than any ocean on Earth. And right now, sealed off from every instrument ever built, it is keeping all of its secrets completely to itself. But there's something else happening in that ocean. Something that took scientists decades to figure out. And when they did, it reframed everything. Here's the problem that should have killed the Europa ocean theory before it ever got started. Europa orbits Jupiter at a distance of about 485 million miles from the Sunday. At that distance, the sun is just a bright star in the sky. The warmth you feel standing outside on a summer day, Europa receives about 25 times less of that energy than Earth does. The surface temperature on Europa averages around -260 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, water shouldn't just be frozen. It should be frozen solid all the way down, right to the rocky core. There should be no ocean. There should be no liquid anything. And yet the ocean is there. 62 miles of it. Liquid, not frozen. Something is heating it from inside. That something is Jupiter. The story starts with Europa's orbit. As mentioned before, Europa doesn't orbit Jupiter in a perfect circle. Its path is slightly oval, and that matters enormously. When Europa is closer to Jupiter in its orbit, Jupiter's gravity pulls on it harder. When Europa is farther away, the pull is weaker. That changing pull causes the entire moon to flex. Imagine squeezing a stress ball in your hand. Squeeze it, release it, squeeze it, release it. After a while, the ball starts to feel warm. The repeated deformation of the material generates friction, and friction generates heat. Europa works the same way. The entire moon is being squeezed and released by Jupiter's gravity, over and over, every 3.5 days. The rock deep inside the moon is being deformed. The ice above it is being stressed. All of that mechanical energy has to go somewhere. It converts into heat. Scientists call this tidal heating, and the amount of heat it generates in Europa's interior is significant enough to melt rock. Wait, melt rock? Europa's rocky core, deep below the ocean, may contain active geology. Areas where the rock is warm enough to flow, possibly areas where the rock is hot enough to push superheated water and dissolved minerals out through cracks in the seafloor. On Earth, those structures are called hydrothermal vents. The most famous cluster of them sits at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Scientists discovered them in the 1970s and were astonished to find entire ecosystems clustered around them in water that was completely lightless and ice cold. The vent water itself can reach temperatures of 700 degrees Fahrenheit. but the cold surrounding ocean keeps the ecosystem stable. Bacteria thrive directly on the chemical energy in the vent water. Everything else in the ecosystem eats those bacteria. If tidal heating is generating similar vents on Europa's seafloor, those vents would be pumping heat, minerals, and chemical energy directly into the ocean from below, an energy source. In a liquid ocean, with the right chemistry, scientists don't know yet whether Europa's seafloor is actually this active. There's a significant debate about that, and it's one of the central questions the next spacecraft will try to answer. Some research suggests the seafloor might be cold and quiet. Other models suggest it could be geologically alive. But here is what is already confirmed. Tidal heating keeps the ocean liquid. The math works. The energy budget adds up. Jupiter is heating Europa from the inside out, and has been doing so for as long as the Moon has existed in its current orbital position. A star 2.5 billion miles away can't reach Europa's ocean. Jupiter doesn't have to. Look at a photograph of Europa's surface and zoom in on any of the rough, jumbled patches that cover about half the Moon. What you see looks exactly like what happens when you drop a sheet of ice on a tile floor. It shatters into irregular chunks, the pieces shift around slightly, and then, if you could somehow refreeze the whole mess, you'd get Europa. Scientists call these regions chaos terrains. The name is accurate. In these zones, the ice surface broke into massive plates, sometimes miles across. Those plates moved. They tilted, they rotated, they slid past each other. Some sank slightly, others rose, and then the whole thing refroze in whatever position the plates had landed in. The result is a surface that looks completely disordered from above, but when scientists carefully mapped the individual ice plates, something remarkable appeared. The plates could be put back together, like puzzle pieces. Take each chunk, reverse its rotation and drift. Slide it back to where it started, and the surface reassembles into a continuous sheet. That means the ice genuinely broke apart and moved, and the only way large sections of a solid ice shell can move around is if there's something fluid underneath to float on. Liquid water. The chaos terrains are direct visual evidence that the ocean isn't just sitting passively under a rigid crust. The ocean is interacting with the ice above it. In these regions, liquid water got close enough to the surface to melt the bottom of the ice shell, break it into fragments, shuffle them around, and refreeze. And here is where it gets more specific. Some of the chaos terrains appear to be sitting above features that scientists call subsurface lakes. These are pockets of liquid water that don't extend all the way down to the main ocean. They're trapped inside the ice shell itself, just a few miles below the surface, like water pockets frozen into the middle of a thick ice wall. A team of scientists studying images of a region called Terra Macula estimated that the subsurface lake beneath it might contain as much liquid water as all 5 of the Great Lakes in the United States combined, sitting just a few miles under the ice, completely isolated, completely dark. What's in that water is a question science cannot currently answer. But here's the detail that makes the chaos terrains scientifically thrilling. If the ice breaks apart, moves around, and refreezes, that process is mixing things. Material from the surface gets dragged down into the ice. Material from below gets pushed up. The boundary between the surface and the ocean is not a sealed, impenetrable wall. It is a zone of exchange. And what's on the surface that might be worth sending down into the ocean? Oxygen. Europa's surface is constantly being bombarded by radiation from Jupiter. That radiation slams into the water ice and breaks it apart, creating oxygen molecules that accumulate on the surface. On Earth, oxygen is what made complex life possible. If chaos terrains are cycling that surface oxygen down into the ocean below, they could be acting as a slow delivery system for one of life's most critical ingredients. The smashed windshield surface of Europa isn't damage. It's a mechanism. 62 miles down, the main ocean sits in total darkness. That's the one people talk about. The vast, planet-sized body of water sealed beneath a frozen shell, waiting to be discovered. But in the last decade, scientists have started to realize that the ocean isn't the only liquid water on Europa. There might be lakes hidden inside the ice itself, not below the ice, inside it. Picture the ice shell as a thick, frozen wall 15 miles deep. Now imagine that inside that wall, scattered at various depths, there are pockets, bubbles of liquid water, surrounded on all sides by solid ice, cut off from the main ocean below and from the surface above, isolated, dark, pressurized. These aren't theoretical constructs. Scientists believe they have photographic evidence. The chaos terrains we talked about in the last chapter aren't randomly distributed across Europa's surface. They cluster in specific regions, and the patterns of how the ice fractured, moved, and refroze in those regions match computer models of what would happen if a subsurface lake formed just a few miles below the surface, heated the ice above it, partially melted the underside of the outer shell, and caused it to collapse inward. The lake doesn't have to reach the surface for it to destroy it. The heat alone is enough. When scientists studied a region called Macula in detail, the topography of the surface matched a model where a lake roughly the volume of all 5 Great Lakes combined was sitting about 2 miles below the ice. 2 miles? That's closer to the surface than the bottom of the Mariana Trenches from the top. For a spacecraft trying to eventually access liquid water on Europa, that changes the math significantly. Drilling through 2 miles of ice is still enormously difficult by any measure, but it is a fundamentally different engineering problem than drilling through 15 miles. Now, here's the question that matters most about these lakes. Are they connected to the main ocean? If a subsurface lake formed because heat from the main ocean melted upward into the ice shell, there may be a connection, a channel, a crack, some kind of conduit through which water and the chemistry dissolved in it can move between the lake and the ocean below. If that connection exists, the lake becomes a sample of the ocean. Whatever is in the ocean might also be in the lake. Minerals, chemicals, possibly biology. And if the lake eventually breaks through to the surface, which the chaos terrains suggest has happened before, then material from deep inside the ocean ends up on the surface of Europa, where a spacecraft flying overhead could potentially detect it without ever touching down. The red and brown streaks staining the chaos terrains? Some of those chemicals may have come from the ocean itself, carried up through subsurface lakes and deposited on the ice surface during a breakup event. The surface of Europa isn't just ice. It's a chemical record of everything that has ever pushed up from below, and scientists are only beginning to learn how to read it. What's written in that record goes deeper than anyone expected, because something was also found recently that no one predicted, sitting in the ice near one of the largest fracture zones on the Moon. Imagine building a house completely underground. You seal it off from the surface. No windows, no vents, no pipes connecting to the outside world. Eventually, the people inside run out of fresh air, and no one survives. That's the problem with Europa's ocean, and it's one of the most important questions in astrobiology right now. The ocean is sealed under 15 miles of ice. The surface has oxygen. Radiation from Jupiter constantly splits water molecules apart on the ice, producing oxygen gas that builds up in the frozen outer layer. Over time, the surface accumulates a significant amount of it. But how does that oxygen get down into the ocean? For life as we know it, oxygen is significant. Many of the most complex organisms on Earth depend on it. The microbes around deep-sea vents on Earth don't breathe oxygen the same way we do. But oxidants, which are chemicals in the same family as oxygen, are still important for driving the chemical reactions that power those ecosystems. If Europa's ocean is completely cut off from its oxygen-rich surface, the chemistry inside might be too limited to support anything complex. The ocean could be sterile, not because it lacks water or heat or minerals, but simply because the surface and the ocean can't talk to each other. So scientists began looking for a mechanism, a pathway, something that could carry oxidants from the surface down through 15 miles of ice and into the water below. The chaos terrains provided the first clue. As described before, those regions involve the ice breaking up, shuffling around, and refreezing. That process drags surface material downward. Surface ice, loaded with oxygen and other radiation-produced chemicals, gets pulled into deeper layers during the chaos events. But chaos terrain events are dramatic and irregular. Scientists wondered if there was a slower, steadier process working alongside them, and in recent years, they found one. Computer models showed that dense, salt-rich ice can form on the surface of Europa through a specific process involving radiation and chemistry. This salt-heavy ice is denser than the surrounding fresher ice. And just like a rock dropped into a pool sinks because it's denser than the water, this heavy ice sinks through the softer ice below it, very slowly, over millions of years. But it sinks, and as it sinks, it carries everything frozen inside it, including the oxidants that built up on the surface, including the chemicals that radiation produced by bombarding the ice for millions of years. The heavy ice drips downward through the ice shell like a very slow leak, carrying a cargo of chemistry from the surface toward the ocean below. Scientists estimate this process could transport a significant amount of oxidants into the ocean over geological time. Enough, potentially, to change the chemistry of the water. Enough to provide fuel. Think of it like a river. The surface of Europa is constantly being loaded with chemicals by radiation. The sinking ice is the river, carrying those chemicals downward through the ice shell, and the ocean is the sea at the end of that river, receiving whatever the surface sends down. If this process has been running for billions of years, the ocean could be far more chemically complex than a simple sealed container of water would be. It could be rich with the kinds of compounds that, on Earth, power entire ecosystems. The surface and the ocean are not completely cut off from each other. They're in slow conversation. And what the surface has been sending down for billions of years might be exactly what life needs. The previous chapter introduced the idea. Now let's look at the science behind it more closely, because the mechanism itself is stranger and more elegant than it sounds. Start with the surface of Europa. Radiation from Jupiter's magnetic field slams into the ice constantly, every second of every day, without pause. That radiation is energetic enough to break the chemical bonds in water ice, splitting molecules apart and rearranging them into new compounds. One of the things this process produces, in significant quantities, is hydrogen peroxide. Hydrogen peroxide sounds ordinary. You probably have a small brown bottle of it in a bathroom cabinet somewhere. But in chemistry, it's a powerful oxidant. It reacts strongly with other compounds. In the right environment, it can drive reactions that release energy. And energy is the currency of life. The surface of Europa, after billions of years of radiation bombardment, is loaded with hydrogen peroxide and other oxidant compounds. They build up in the ice layer by layer, year after year, accumulating silently in the cold. Now here's the key. When radiation hits ice that contains salts, dissolved minerals from any water that once passed through that region, the chemistry changes. The radiation interacts with the salts and the water molecules together, producing a different kind of ice. This radiation-processed, salt-rich ice has a higher density than ordinary water ice. Density is the critical word. Ice floats on water because ice is less dense than liquid water. That's unusual. Most solid materials are denser than their liquid form and sink. Water is one of the exceptions. But this dense, salt-heavy, radiation-processed ice is different. It's denser than the softer, fresher ice around it. And just as a chunk of waterlogged wood eventually sinks while a dry log floats, this heavy ice begins to sink through the ice shell. Scientists built computer models of this process and tracked how the dense ice blobs would behave over millions of years. The models showed something remarkable. The dense ice doesn't just sink a short distance and stop. It punches through. It descends through the entire ice shell, carrying its cargo of oxidants, and eventually reaches the ocean below, where it melts. When it melts, it releases everything it was carrying into the ocean water. Hydrogen peroxide, other oxidant compounds, salts, all of it delivered from the surface to the seafloor in one slow, gravity-driven drip. The scientific term for this process is brine drainage. though the sinking ice mechanism is also called a diapir in geology. The important thing is not the name, but what it means. Europa has a natural delivery system, a conveyor belt running from its radiation-soaked surface down through 15 miles of ice into the ocean below. The conveyor belt runs slowly, over geological timescales, but it runs continuously. It has been running for as long as the surface has been accumulating oxidants. One research team estimated that over the age of Europa's current surface, roughly 40 to 90 million years, enough oxidants could have been delivered to the ocean to power chemical reactions at a scale comparable to what drives life in Earth's deep-sea vent ecosystems. That's not a guarantee of life. The chemistry still has to be right. The temperature has to be right. Many other factors matter, but the delivery system exists. The surface is talking to the ocean. And if something in that ocean has been listening for billions of years, the chemistry arriving from above might be exactly the kind of signal it learned to feed on. The next question is whether there's any evidence of that exchange happening in a more sudden, dramatic way. There is, and it left a scar on Europa's surface that scientists only just identified. In early 2026, a team of scientists did something unusual. They went back to data collected by the Galileo spacecraft, data that had been sitting in NASA archives for nearly 30 years, and reanalyzed it using modern tools. What they found changed the conversation about Europa's ocean chemistry overnight. Ammonia, specifically ammonia-bearing compounds, detected right at the surface of Europa, clustered near the largest fracture zones on the Moon. Now, ammonia sounds simple. It's a gas with a sharp smell that most people associate with cleaning products. But in chemistry, it's far more significant than that. And in the context of Europa, its presence near fracture zones carries a very specific implication. Ammonia is a natural antifreeze. When ammonia mixes with water, it lowers the freezing point of the mixture significantly. Pure water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Water with ammonia dissolved in it can stay liquid at temperatures well below that. How far below depends on the concentration, but in significant amounts, ammonia can keep water liquid down to around -100 degrees Fahrenheit. That's relevant on Europa for one key reason. Europa's ice shell gets colder toward the surface. The top of the shell is exposed to the freezing vacuum of space and sits at around -260 degrees Fahrenheit. But deeper in the shell, closer to the ocean, it's warmer. The heat from below keeps the deeper ice relatively soft and the ocean itself liquid. There are zones within the ice shell where the temperature is marginal, cold enough to freeze pure water, but potentially warm enough to keep ammonia-water mixtures liquid. Finding ammonia near the fracture zones suggests something specific. The ammonia didn't come from the surface. Europa's surface chemistry is driven by radiation from Jupiter, and radiation doesn't produce ammonia from water ice. Ammonia has to come from a source of nitrogen, and that source is most likely deeper inside the Moon. If ammonia is appearing at fracture zones, near the places where the ice has cracked and split, the most likely explanation is that ammonia-rich water from somewhere below the surface pushed up through those cracks and then froze when it reached the cold outer environment. In other words, the ocean, or something connected to it, reached the surface. And if the water that reached the surface carried ammonia, it could have carried other things too: minerals, organic compounds. Whatever chemistry has been building up in that ocean for billions of years, some fraction of it may have vented through the fractures and deposited itself right on the surface. This is significant for Europa Clipper. The spacecraft will fly close to Europa's surface repeatedly, measuring chemical compositions. If ammonia-bearing water vented through fractures, the chemical signature left behind is exactly the kind of target the Clipper's instruments are designed to detect. But the ammonia finding also carries a more speculative implication. If pockets of ammonia-water mixture exist within the ice shell, not in the main ocean but trapped in the ice above it, those pockets could be liquid right now. Liquid water sitting not 62 miles underground but potentially just a few miles below the surface, kept from freezing by ammonia, acting as a chemical antifreeze. Liquid water, close to the surface, in a place where the chemistry is complex and active. The ammonia is not proof of life. It is proof that the chemistry of Europa's interior is more complex and more active than the simple picture of a frozen moon with a sealed ocean suggested. Something is happening in that ice. Something has been pushing material upward, and the fractures are where it leaves its mark. In December 2025, a team studying archived images of Europa's surface published a paper about something they found inside a crater called Manannan. Manannan is one of the few well-preserved impact craters on Europa. Most craters on the Moon have been erased by the constant resurfacing process. Manannan survived. It's roughly 15 miles across, and its floor and rim show the classic features of a large impact into an icy surface. But inside the crater, scientists found something that had no business being there. A spider. Not a real spider, obviously. A scar shaped exactly like one. A central point with long, jagged lines radiating outward in all directions, like the legs of a spider frozen in ice. The feature was formally named Damhan Allah, which is the Irish phrase for spider. Impact craters don't naturally produce spider-shaped scars. When a rock hits a surface, the crater is circular or oval. It has a rim, a flat floor, sometimes a central peak, where material rebounded upward after the impact. There's no mechanism in a simple impact that produces a starburst pattern spreading out from a point. So where did the spider come from? The team proposed an explanation based on what happens when an impact hits ice that has liquid water beneath it. When the asteroid or comet slammed into Manannan, the initial explosion was enormous. The energy of the impact superheated the ice and rock, creating the circular crater, but the impact also did something else. It created a pressure wave that traveled downward through the ice shell. If there was liquid water close to the surface in that region, either a subsurface lake or a region where the ocean was unusually close to the crust, that pressure wave reached the water. The sudden pressure caused the water to push back violently. A pulse of liquid water and brine surged upward through cracks in the newly fractured ice. As the brine reached the surface, it spread outward in all directions from the impact point. Then the cold immediately froze it in place. The result was a starburst of frozen brine radiating out from the center of the crater, lines of salt-stained ice stretching outward from a central point, preserved in the frozen surface for millions of years. A spider, frozen in place the instant the brine reached the cold. The Damhan Allah scar is essentially a photograph of a moment, a single violent event captured in ice. An impact hit the surface, punched down toward liquid water. The water surged upward, and then the cold took over and froze everything exactly as it was. What the scar tells scientists is layered with implications. It means liquid water in that region was close enough to the surface to respond to an impact. It means brine, water loaded with dissolved minerals and salts, reached the surface. It means the ice shell in that area was thin enough, or warm enough, or both, for liquid to exist shallowly beneath it. And it means that the same kind of brine that vented at Manannan might be venting through the fractures near the ammonia deposits. The same chemistry, the same upward push of liquid through ice, expressed in different ways across different parts of the Moon. The surface of Europa is covered in the fingerprints of its hidden ocean. The spider at Manannan wasn't a one-time event. It was one dramatic example of a process that likely happens across Europa whenever the right conditions align. Brine, liquid water, loaded with dissolved salts and minerals, pushes upward through the ice and reaches the surface. Understanding how that works requires understanding what brine actually is and why it behaves differently from ordinary water. When liquid water is trapped inside a body of ice and the surrounding temperature drops, the water doesn't all freeze at once. Pure water, the molecules with no dissolved minerals or salts, freezes first. As those molecules lock into ice crystals, the remaining liquid becomes more concentrated. The salts and minerals that were diluted across the whole volume are now packed into a smaller and smaller amount of liquid. This concentrated, salt-heavy water is brine, And as established with the ammonia discovery, dissolved salts and minerals lower the freezing point of water. The brine resists freezing even as the temperature continues to drop. It stays liquid long after the surrounding ice has solidified. Now imagine this brine trapped inside Europa's ice shell. It sits in a pocket, surrounded by solid ice on all sides. The pressure from the weight of ice above it is significant. Europa's gravity is weaker than Earth's, roughly 1/8 as strong, but 15 miles of ice above a pocket of liquid still generates real pressure. That pressure squeezes the brine, and brine under pressure looks for a way out. Ice is not perfectly solid. It has grain boundaries, the microscopic lines where individual ice crystals meet. It has fractures from the tidal flexing of Jupiter. It has zones weakened by the chaos terrain events. Any of those pathways can act as a channel. When the brine is under enough pressure, it forces itself into those channels and begins moving upward. Not quickly. This isn't a geyser. It's a slow, relentless creep driven by pressure and the difference in density between the liquid brine and the surrounding solid ice. As the brine moves upward toward the colder surface, some of it freezes along the way, depositing salt crystals in the walls of the channel. But enough of it continues moving. When it reaches the surface, or gets close enough, it either vents into the vacuum of space as a plume, or spreads across the surface and freezes immediately in the intense cold. Either way, it leaves a chemical signature. Salts, minerals, whatever compounds were dissolved in the water. Scientists believe this is where the red and brown streaks on Europa's surface originate. The brine that reaches the surface is loaded with compounds that react with radiation from Jupiter and turn reddish-brown. The streaks mark old channels where brine pushed upward, froze, and left its cargo of chemistry on the ice. The fractures on Europa aren't just cracks, they're highways, two-way highways. Oxygen and oxidants move down through the sinking salt process. Brine and minerals push upward through brine migration. The ice shell is not a passive barrier sitting between the surface and the ocean. It's a dynamic, chemically active exchange zone. And that exchange has consequences for everything scientists are trying to figure out about Europa's potential to support life. Because if brine is carrying materials up from the ocean to the surface, and if a spacecraft flying over Europa can detect what's in that brine, you could potentially learn what's in the ocean without ever touching it. That idea is exactly what the next spacecraft to visit Europa is designed to test. Here's a fact that sounds like something from a disaster movie, but is completely real. A human being standing on the surface of Europa, wearing no protection, would receive a lethal dose of radiation in less than 10 minutes. Jupiter is the source. The planet generates one of the most powerful magnetic fields in the solar system, thousands of times stronger than Earth's magnetic field. That field doesn't just sit around Jupiter. It extends outward for millions of miles, filling the entire Jupiter system with a vast, invisible electromagnetic structure called the magnetosphere. Inside that magnetosphere, charged particles, electrons and protons mostly, get trapped and accelerated. Jupiter's magnetic field spins with the planet, which rotates faster than any other planet in the solar system, completing a full rotation in just under 10 hours. As the field spins, it flings those trapped particles around at incredible speeds. The result is a radiation belt around Jupiter that makes Earth's Van Allen belts look gentle by comparison. Europa orbits right through the heart of that radiation environment. Every square inch of its surface is constantly bombarded. High-energy particles slam into the ice at close to the speed of light. They punch through the surface layer, breaking molecular bonds, generating new chemical compounds, and in the process, depositing enough energy to kill any biology that we know of within minutes of exposure. This is one of the fundamental tensions at the heart of the Europa life question. The surface chemistry is rich and interesting, partly because radiation is creating complex compounds in the ice. But the surface itself is completely uninhabitable for life as we know it. If life exists on Europa, it lives in the ocean. The ice above acts as a shield. How effective a shield depends on depth. Research suggests that below about 30 feet of ice, the radiation intensity drops to a level comparable to what you'd experience inside a nuclear reactor. Not comfortable by any standard, but survivable for radiation-resistant organisms. Below several hundred feet, the radiation becomes minimal. The ocean, sitting under miles of ice, would be almost completely shielded. But here's the detail that flips this from a pure threat into something more ambiguous. The radiation hitting the surface isn't just destroying things, it's building things. When high-energy particles slam into water ice, they split molecules and drive chemical reactions that produce compounds like hydrogen peroxide, oxygen, sulfur compounds, and a range of other oxidants. These compounds are energetically valuable. On Earth, oxidants power the chemistry of life at a fundamental level. Every living thing on Earth uses oxidation reactions to extract energy from food. The oxygen you breathe is an oxidant. The reason breathing feels essential is because oxidants are the fuel that powers your cells. If Europa's radiation-produced surface oxidants can reach the ocean, either through the sinking ice process or through fractures and brine migration, they could provide a chemical energy source for whatever is living down there. The radiation that makes Europa's surface lethal to anything standing on it may also be the engine that keeps the chemistry below lively enough to support biology. The deadliest environment on the Moon is also, potentially, its life support system. The radiation belt around Jupiter is one of the most hostile environments in the solar system. That was the last chapter. Now consider this. Without it, Europa's ocean might be too chemically quiet to support life at all. This is one of the most counterintuitive ideas in all of astrobiology. The thing that makes the surface uninhabitable is potentially the thing that makes the ocean habitable. Here's the logic. Life requires energy. Every living thing, from a bacterium on the ocean floor to a blue whale in the Pacific, needs a continuous supply of energy to maintain the chemical reactions that keep it alive. On the surface of Earth, almost all of that energy ultimately comes from sunlight. Plants capture sunlight and convert it to chemical energy. Everything that eats plants gets that energy second-hand. Everything that eats something that eats plants gets it third-hand. The whole web of surface life runs on solar energy. In Europa's ocean, there is no sunlight. None. The sun is a distant point of light in the sky above the ice. By the time its energy travels 485 million miles and hits the 15-mile thick ice shell, essentially none of it reaches the water below. So the ocean needs a different energy source. Two candidates exist. The first is chemical energy from hydrothermal vents on the seafloor, where tidal heating drives hot, mineral-rich water up through cracks in the rock. That's the geological energy source, and it's significant but uncertain depending on how active the seafloor actually is. The second is the radiation pathway. Jupiter's radiation creates hydrogen peroxide and other oxidants on the surface. The sinking ice mechanism described in Chapter 9 carries those oxidants down through the ice shell and eventually delivers them to the ocean. In the ocean, those oxidants can react with materials that well up from the seafloor, including hydrogen sulfide, methane, and other chemicals that hydrothermal vents would produce if the seafloor is active. When an oxidant meets a reductant, a chemical like hydrogen sulfide that wants to donate electrons, a reaction happens. That reaction releases energy. That energy can power life. On Earth, in the deep sea vent ecosystems, bacteria perform exactly this process. They take oxidants and reductants, combine them, and harvest the energy from the resulting reaction. The bacteria don't need sunlight. They run entirely on chemistry. Scientists call this chemolithotrophy. It sounds complex, but the idea is simple. Eat rocks, or more precisely, eat the chemical energy locked up in the reaction between minerals and oxidants. If Europa's ocean receives a steady supply of oxidants from above and a steady supply of reductants from below, the chemical conditions for chemolithotrophic life would be present. The radiation that blasts the surface is the pump on top. The tidal heating is the pump at the bottom. Between them, they could be circulating enough chemical energy through the ocean to sustain microbial life. This model doesn't guarantee life. Many planets and moons in our solar system have met individual requirements for life without producing it. Having energy, water, and chemistry in the same place is necessary but may not be sufficient. But Europa meets those conditions, and it has been meeting them for billions of years. That's a very long time for chemistry to figure something out. Fly above Europa at low altitude and you'd see the ridges before almost anything else. Long, parallel lines crossing the surface in every direction. Some run straight for hundreds of miles before curving. Others stretch over 3,000 miles from one end to the other, long enough to cross the entire continental United States. They rise hundreds of feet off the surface, casting long shadows when the sun hits them at a low angle. From above, they look like something giant drew on the moon with a crayon. From the side, they look like rows of frozen waves, crests of ice running in parallel across a flat, frozen sea. Europa's ridges are the single most common surface feature on the moon. They crisscross almost everywhere, layering on top of older ridges in some regions, standing alone in others. Scientists classify them into several types based on their shape. Some are simple single ridges, a narrow crest running in a line. Others are double ridges, two parallel walls of ice with a valley between them. The double ridges are the most common, and they carry a clue to how they formed. Imagine a crack opening in the ice. The crack runs deep, possibly all the way down through the ice shell to the ocean below. When the crack opens, water under pressure at the base, where the ice meets the liquid ocean, can surge upward into the gap. The water is warmer than the surrounding ice. As it pushes up, the walls of the crack melt slightly. Then, as the tidal forces relax and the crack begins to close again, the warm water and slush in the gap gets squeezed. The material that can't fit back into the crack gets pushed sideways, up along the edges, where it refreezes. Each time the crack opens and closes, a little more material is pushed up along the sides. Over thousands of cycles, two parallel ridges build up on either side of the crack, with the original crack now forming a valley between them. The crack opens and closes because of Jupiter's tidal forces, cycling every 3.5 days. Over thousands to millions of years, that slow pumping action builds ridges hundreds of feet tall. This formation model means every double ridge on Europa is marking a place where the ice cracked all the way through, where ocean water reached toward the surface repeatedly, and where material from deep below was pushed up and deposited on the outer crust. The ridges are not just topography, they are records of communication between the ocean and the surface, physical monuments to the cracks that have acted as two-way channels for water, chemistry, and potentially for any biology carried along in the flow. Some ridges on Europa appear fresh and sharp-edged, suggesting they are geologically recent. Others are worn down and partially buried under newer ice, implying they are ancient. The layering of young ridges over old ones shows that this process has been happening continuously, with different cracks opening and closing at different times across the moon. And here is the detail that makes the ridge system important for the upcoming mission. Europa Clipper will use radar to peer through the ice shell along ridges. If a crack extends all the way down to the ocean, the radar should be able to detect the boundary between ice and liquid water. If liquid is sitting just below the surface of a ridge system, that would be a prime target for any future lander mission. The ridges are Europa's most visible feature. They may also be its most revealing one. Look at Europa in detail, and one thing stands out immediately. The surface isn't white. Large sections of it are stained. A reddish-brown color marks the fractures, the ridges, and the chaos terrains. The staining follows the cracks. It colors the places where material pushed up from below and froze. It traces the lines where brine migrated through the ice and deposited its contents on the surface. For decades, scientists debated what exactly was in those stains. Some of the earliest theories pointed to iron compounds. Iron salts can be reddish-brown, and iron is a plausible component of any water that has been in contact with rocky material. Jupiter's own moon, Io, which is heavily volcanic, deposits sulfur compounds across the Jupiter system, and some sulfur compounds are also reddish. But as analysis tools improved, a more specific picture emerged. The dominant chemistry in Europa's reddish regions appears to be magnesium sulfate and sodium chloride, salts. The kind of salts you'd expect to find dissolved in ocean water that had been in contact with rock for billions of years. Sodium chloride, specifically, is table salt, the same compound that makes Earth's oceans salty. Laboratory experiments helped confirm this. Scientists took sodium chloride samples and irradiated them under conditions similar to what Europa's surface experiences from Jupiter's radiation belt. After prolonged radiation exposure, the sodium chloride changed color. It turned yellow and then orange-brown. The radiation was altering the chemical structure of the salt, creating color centers, defects in the crystal lattice that absorb light differently than the original compound. The reddish-brown stains on Europa, according to this research, are salt. Specifically, salt that was dissolved in liquid water, delivered to the surface by brine migration or chaos terrain events, and then chemically altered by Jupiter's radiation until it turned the color we see today. This matters because salt dissolved in liquid water is a marker. The salt didn't fall from space. It didn't form on the surface from scratch. Salt in that form, at those concentrations, in those locations, had to be dissolved in liquid water first. And that liquid water had to come from somewhere inside the moon. The reddish streaks on Europa are essentially a map of where liquid water reached the surface. Every stained crack, every colored chaos terrain, every reddish ridge flank, all of those mark a place where ocean water, or brine connected to the ocean, touched the surface of the moon. Scientists have now mapped these stained regions across the entire visible surface of Europa. The map shows that brine has reached the surface in a striking number of locations. The exchange between the ocean and the surface isn't happening in just one or two isolated spots. It's widespread. It's global. The ocean below isn't sealed and silent. It's active and expressive. It's been pushing chemistry to the surface for millions of years and leaving evidence all over the ice. When Europa Clipper arrives in 2030 and begins its detailed chemical surveys, those reddish regions will be priority targets. The instruments on board can identify specific compounds in the surface material. If they find organic molecules mixed in with the salt, which are carbon-based compounds that are the building blocks of biology, the implications would be extraordinary. The red stains are not just coloring, they are messages from the ocean. And for the first time in human history, we will soon have the ability to start reading them properly. Stand on the moon on any clear night and you can see the craters with your naked eye. Dark circles, bright-rimmed bowls, overlapping rings covering the surface in every direction. The moon is a record. Every crater is a timestamp, a mark from a rock that hit it at some point in the past 4.5 billion years. Because the moon has no atmosphere, no oceans, no geological activity to erase those marks. They stay exactly where they were made, permanent, preserved, a diary written in impact. Now look at Europa and count the craters. There are around 24 confirmed impact craters on the entire moon. 24. On a surface nearly the same size as Earth's moon. Earth's moon has hundreds of thousands of visible craters. Europa has 24. Something is erasing them. The rate at which comets and asteroids hit objects in the Jupiter system is well understood. Scientists have estimated how many impacts Europa should have accumulated over its history based on that rate. The answer is hundreds of thousands, similar to what other large moons in the solar system show on their surfaces. But almost none of those craters are visible. The surface doesn't show them. They're gone. The only way to remove a crater is to bury it under new material, melt the surface and refreeze it, or push the old ice away and replace it with fresh ice from below. All three of those processes require geological activity. They require a dynamic interior that is continuously renewing the surface from below. Scientists estimated Europa's surface age based on the crater count. The result was between 40 million and 90 million years old. For comparison, the lunar surface is up to 4 billion years old. Europa's surface, by this measure, refreshed itself within the last 100 million years and may still be refreshing today. The implication is direct. The surface of Europa is being continuously rebuilt by whatever is happening underneath. The ocean is not a static, inert body of water sitting sealed in the dark. It's an active participant in the surface geology of the moon. Material moves up. The old surface gets buried or melted. New ice forms. This turnover has another consequence. If any biology exists in Europa's ocean, the products of that biology could end up in the surface ice. Biological molecules, the complex organic compounds that living things produce and that survive after they die, could be cycled upward through the ice over millions of years. Europa's fresh surface might contain biological evidence from its ancient ocean, preserved in the newly formed ice, right where a spacecraft's instruments could detect them. The same resurfacing process that erases the craters might be depositing the most important evidence ever found of life beyond Earth. Europa keeps erasing its past. But in doing so, it keeps writing its present. And we are about to read it. Drop a camera to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, specifically to a region called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and you'd see something that looks like it belongs on another planet. Towers of mineral rock rising from the sea floor, some of them 60 feet tall. Superheated water shooting out of their tips at several hundred degrees Fahrenheit, black with dissolved minerals, billowing upward like smoke from a chimney. The surrounding water is just above freezing. The temperature difference between the vent water and the surrounding ocean happens within inches, and clustered around every single one of those vents, life. Tube worms, 6 feet long, anchored to the rock, blind shrimp swarming in the mineral clouds, crabs picking through the bacterial mats that coat every surface. Entire ecosystems running without a single ray of sunlight, powered entirely by the chemical energy in the vent water. Scientists discovered these ecosystems in 1977, and it permanently changed our understanding of where life can exist. Now picture something similar on the floor of Europa's ocean. The geometry would be different. Europa's seafloor is a rocky surface sitting at the bottom of a 62-mile deep ocean of salt water under miles of ice, in total and permanent darkness. The pressure at that depth would be extreme, roughly 1,000 times the pressure at the surface of Earth's ocean, because Europa's deep ocean compresses everything below it with the combined weight of all that water. At the seafloor, tidal heating generated by Jupiter's gravitational squeezing could be creating hotspots, places where the rock is warm enough to crack, where water seeps down through fissures in the rock, heats up in contact with the warm interior, and then surges back upward loaded with dissolved minerals. The minerals would be different from Earth's vent systems because Europa's rock has a different composition. Sulfur compounds would likely be present, silicates, iron and magnesium compounds, possibly carbon compounds depending on the original chemical makeup of the moon's rocky core. When that mineral-rich water hits the cold ocean, the minerals precipitate out of solution and build up around the vent opening, exactly as they do on Earth. Over thousands of years, a chimney structure forms. The chimney grows as long as the vent keeps flowing. Around that chimney, if the chemistry is right, bacteria could establish themselves. Not oxygen-breathing bacteria, chemolithotrophic bacteria, the same type found in Earth's deep-sea vents that harvest energy directly from the chemical reactions between the vent fluid and the surrounding cold ocean water. Above the bacteria, if the ecosystem has had time to develop complexity, other organisms might feed on the bacteria. Simple animals, soft-bodied creatures adapted to high pressure, total darkness, and temperatures that swing sharply from near freezing to scalding within a short distance. This is speculative. Scientists have not confirmed hydrothermal vents on Europa, The debate about whether the seafloor is even warm enough to produce them is ongoing and unresolved, but the physics allows for it. The chemistry supports it, and the existence of similar ecosystems on Earth shows it can work. If those vents exist on Europa's seafloor, they have been running for potentially billions of years. An ecosystem around a vent on Earth can sustain itself for decades or centuries before the vent cools. An ecosystem around a vent that has been running for 1 billion years would have had extraordinary time to develop, adapt, and diversify. The seafloor of Europa's ocean might be dotted with oases of heat and chemistry, each one surrounded by a bubble of life in an otherwise cold and dark abyss. We don't know yet, but in 12 years, we will be close enough to start finding out. Here is the single most important unresolved question about Europa's potential to support life, and scientists are currently split on the answer. Is the seafloor warm, active, and geologically alive? Or is it cold, rigid, and completely inert? The answer determines almost everything. If the seafloor is active, with hydrothermal vents pumping heat and minerals into the ocean from below, Europa becomes one of the most promising places in the solar system to look for life. The energy source is there, the chemistry is there, the water is there, the time is there. Life would have everything it needs. If the seafloor is inactive, cold and dark and chemically quiet, the ocean becomes a much harder place to sustain biology. The only energy entering the system would come from the oxidants dripping down through the ice from the radiation-blasted surface above. That's a slower, thinner energy supply. It might be enough for microbial life. It might not be enough for anything at all. Two significant studies published in early 2026 approached this question from different angles and reached different conclusions. The first study modeled Europa's internal structure and the heat flow from tidal heating. The researchers found that Europa's rocky core might be too rigid to allow the kind of fracturing and fluid movement that drives hydrothermal vent activity. On Earth, geological activity requires rock that can crack, shift, and allow water to circulate through it. The study suggested that Europa's core rock might be compressed too tightly by the enormous pressure of the ocean above it to be that flexible. In that scenario, the seafloor would be a flat, cold, geologically inert surface. No vents, no chimneys, just rock and water sitting in the dark without any significant exchange of heat or chemistry. The second study took a different approach and focused on the ice shell rather than the seafloor. It modeled how the sinking salt mechanism works and estimated how much chemical energy could arrive at the ocean through that process over geological time. The conclusion was that even without an active seafloor, the chemical energy delivered from above could potentially sustain microbial ecosystems in the ocean water itself. Organisms floating in the water column, feeding on the chemical reactions between the descending oxidants and whatever minerals are naturally dissolved in the ocean. These two studies don't necessarily contradict each other. The seafloor could be inactive, and the ocean could still contain life sustained by chemistry from above. But the type of life, its complexity, its abundance, and how it is distributed through the ocean would look very different depending on which scenario is correct. An active seafloor creates localized hotspots of intense biology, like a coral reef around a vent, while the surrounding ocean might be relatively sparse. An inactive seafloor fed by chemistry from above creates a more uniform, diffuse environment, where any life present would be spread thinly through the water column, rather than clustered around specific features. Europa Clipper cannot directly image the seafloor. It will fly over the surface repeatedly, but its instruments look through the ice, not through 62 miles of ocean. What it can do is measure the chemistry of the surface materials, look for signs of recent geological activity in the ice, and map the heat signatures of different regions. If the seafloor is active in specific areas, the effects of that activity might be visible in the ice above those areas, in the form of fresher fractures, newer chaos terrains, or unusual chemical signatures. The answer is there. It's just buried under an ocean. In 1977, A submersible exploring the Galapagos Rift on the ocean floor dropped down to a depth of about 1.5 miles and found life in a place where science said life should not exist. No sunlight, crushing pressure, near freezing water, chemical concentrations that would be toxic to most surface organisms. And yet, life. Thriving, diverse, complex life. Since then, scientists have found organisms in conditions that keep stretching the boundaries of what biology can tolerate. Life has been found inside solid rock, 2 miles underground, feeding on hydrogen produced by the slow chemical reaction between water and certain types of rock. Life has been found in water so acidic it would dissolve metal. Life has been found in boiling hydrothermal vent water at temperatures above 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Life has been found frozen inside glaciers, in a state of suspended animation for millions of years, reviving when the ice melts. The organisms that thrive in these environments are called extremophiles. Organisms that don't just tolerate extreme conditions, but specifically require them. Every time scientists find a new class of extremophile on Earth, they expand the map of where life could theoretically exist elsewhere in the solar system. For Europa specifically, several categories of Earth extremophiles are directly relevant. First are the organisms that live in complete darkness in Earth's deep oceans. They have no relationship with sunlight. Their entire energy supply comes from chemical gradients in the water. They demonstrate that an ocean completely sealed off from solar energy is not automatically a dead ocean. Second are the organisms found in Lake Vostok in Antarctica. Lake Vostok is a body of liquid fresh water sitting under more than 2 miles of ice on the Antarctic continent. It has been isolated from the surface for at least 15 million years. Scientists drilled down to it and found microbial life. An isolated, ice-covered liquid water environment is not automatically sterile. Third are the organisms called piezophiles, pressure-loving bacteria that specifically thrive under the crushing pressures found in the deepest ocean trenches, like the Mariana Trench. Europa's ocean, at its deepest point, would have pressures dramatically higher than anything in Earth's oceans. Piezophiles demonstrate that extreme pressure does not automatically prevent life. Fourth are the radiation-resistant bacteria, the most famous being a species that can survive doses of radiation thousands of times higher than what would kill a human. These organisms have sophisticated DNA repair mechanisms that fix radiation damage almost as fast as it occurs. If similar organisms existed in Europa's ocean, the radiation that makes the surface lethal would not be a factor at their depth. None of this proves life exists on Europa. Proving life requires finding it. But it dismantles the easy objections. Dark ocean? Life is fine with that. Ice cover? Life is fine with that. Extreme pressure? Life handles it. Isolation for millions of years? Life manages. The organisms in Earth's most extreme environments have collectively answered nearly every automatic dismissal of Europa as a candidate for life. They leave only one real question standing. Is the chemistry rich enough? Is there enough energy flowing continuously enough to sustain biology over geological timescales? That's the question the next 2 chapters begin to address from the geological side. And it's the question that Europa Clipper was ultimately built to help answer. In 2012, a team of astronomers pointed the Hubble Space Telescope at Europa and saw something that made them look twice. Rising from the surface of the Moon, extending more than 100 miles into space above the southern hemisphere, was a plume, a column of water vapor, erupting from the surface of Europa and shooting out into the vacuum of Jupiter's magnetosphere. This was not expected. Scientists knew that Enceladus, a moon of Saturn, had active water plumes. Enceladus has become famous for them. The plumes erupt from a set of long fractures near its south pole, carrying water vapor, ice particles, organic molecules, and even molecular hydrogen out into space. A spacecraft called Cassini flew directly through the Enceladus plumes and sampled their contents. But Europa was supposed to be different. Larger, colder, with a thicker ice shell. The expectation was that any liquid water was too deep below the surface to produce the kind of activity seen on Enceladus. The Hubble observation suggested otherwise. Over the following years, the detection was repeated multiple times, though not consistently. The plumes appeared to be intermittent, appearing and disappearing rather than erupting continuously. Some observations showed them clearly. Other observations of the same regions showed nothing. The inconsistency made confirmation difficult. Then scientists went back to the Galileo data from the 1990s. They reanalyzed the magnetic field and charged particle measurements from a specific Galileo flyby that had passed unusually close to Europa's surface in late 1997. When they applied modern analysis techniques to that old data, they found a signature in the magnetic field readings that precisely matched what you would expect if the spacecraft had flown through the edge of a water plume. Galileo had flown through a plume 20 years before scientists realized it. The implications of active plumes are enormous for the search for life. If water from the ocean is erupting into space, it carries whatever is dissolved in that ocean water with it: salts, minerals, organic compounds, potentially biological material. A spacecraft that flies through a Europa plume could directly sample the ocean without ever having to land on the surface, drill through miles of ice, or make contact with the moon at all. The ocean would be delivering samples directly into space, and all the spacecraft would have to do is fly through the cloud and analyze what it collects. This is exactly what the Cassini mission did at Enceladus, and the results were striking. The Enceladus plumes contain complex organic molecules, molecular hydrogen consistent with ongoing hydrothermal activity, and silica particles that can only form in hot water in contact with rock. Europa Clipper is not designed with a plume sampling fly-through as its primary mission, but its trajectory includes passes over regions where plumes have been detected. Its instruments are sensitive enough to detect trace amounts of organic compounds, salts, and other materials in the extremely thin gas environment near Europa's surface. If a plume is active during one of those passes, the Clipper will fly through it, and if the ocean is carrying anything interesting upward, the Clipper will find it. Here is a problem that sounds like it belongs in a science fiction story, but is one of the most serious operational concerns in planetary science. Spacecraft are built by humans in facilities on Earth. Earth is covered in microorganisms. Billions of bacteria, fungi, and other microbial life inhabit almost every surface on this planet, including the surfaces of cleanrooms, tools, and spacecraft components. No matter how carefully engineers try to sterilize a spacecraft, eliminating every single microorganism is extraordinarily difficult. Heat sterilization, the most effective method, involves baking components at temperatures high enough to kill biological material. But some spacecraft components, particularly sensitive electronics, can't survive those temperatures. Chemical sterilization works on surfaces, but doesn't always penetrate into materials. Radiation sterilization is effective for some components, but not all. And some bacteria don't die easily. Bacterial spores, the dormant, protective form that many bacteria adopt under stress, can survive remarkable conditions. Spores have been found alive after being exposed to the vacuum of space for years. Some have survived doses of radiation that would destroy most electronics. Some were revived after being frozen for millions of years in permafrost. The concern is specific. If a spacecraft carrying Earth bacteria crashes on Europa or lands on it and the bacteria survive, they could potentially reach the ocean through cracks in the ice. Once in the ocean, if conditions are even marginally hospitable, they could potentially survive and reproduce. If that happened, and if scientists later discovered biological signatures in Europa's ocean or on its surface, there would be no way to know whether those signatures came from native Europa life or from Earth bacteria introduced by human spacecraft. The scientific value of the discovery would be permanently compromised. You could never be certain you had found alien life rather than contaminated Earth life. This is why NASA ended the Galileo mission by deliberately crashing the spacecraft into Jupiter. rather than letting it drift and potentially impact Europa. Galileo had been in space for 14 years. Its sterilization was not designed to the standard required for a body with significant life potential. Letting it crash on Europa accidentally was considered an unacceptable risk. The same logic governed the entire mission design. Europa Clipper is designed as an orbiter, not a lander. It will orbit Jupiter and make repeated flybys of Europa, never actually landing on the surface. This dramatically reduces the contamination risk. Any future lander mission targeting Europa will face the most stringent sterilization requirements in the history of space exploration. The engineering challenge is not just getting to Europa and drilling through its ice, it's arriving there clean. Meeting that standard with all the complex instruments a lander would need is one of the defining technical problems of the next generation of planetary science. The search for life in Europa's ocean has to be conducted in a way that preserves the certainty of whatever is found. Otherwise, the discovery means nothing. On September 21st, 2003, a spacecraft that had traveled billions of miles from Earth and spent 8 years orbiting Jupiter was aimed at the largest planet in the solar system and allowed to fall in. Galileo hit Jupiter's atmosphere at roughly 108,000 miles per hour. The atmosphere compressed in front of the spacecraft, heating to temperatures hotter than the surface of the Sunday. The spacecraft broke apart in seconds. Whatever remained burned up completely in the thick atmosphere. It was a deliberate choice. NASA scientists made it on purpose. Galileo launched in 1989 and arrived at Jupiter in 1995 after a 6-year journey that included flybys of Venus and Earth to pick up gravitational speed. Once at Jupiter, it deployed a probe directly into Jupiter's atmosphere, then settled into orbit around the planet and began its primary mission. Over the next 8 years, Galileo made 11 close flybys of Europa and dozens of passes near Jupiter's other major moons. The data it sent back was transformative. The magnetic field measurements that confirmed Europa's ocean, the surface images revealing the chaos terrains and ridge systems in detail, the chemical composition data that showed the surface was covered in salts. By 2003, Galileo was running low on propellant. Its instruments were degrading. The radiation from Jupiter's magnetosphere had taken a significant toll on the electronics over 8 years of operation in one of the most radioactive environments in the solar system. The mission team had to decide what to do with the spacecraft when operations ended. Options included parking it in a stable orbit around Jupiter, which would have left it drifting indefinitely. The risk was that over decades or centuries, gravitational interactions could eventually send it on a collision course with Europa or another moon. The team chose the controlled crash into Jupiter. By steering Galileo into Jupiter's atmosphere, they guaranteed that the spacecraft would be completely destroyed, with zero chance of any biological contamination from its components ever reaching Europa. The decision reflected how seriously the scientific community was taking the contamination issue even in 2003, before the first detailed proposals for landing on Europa had even been written. If scientists were already willing to sacrifice a functioning spacecraft to protect the scientific integrity of a future mission, it shows how much weight they give to the possibility that Europa's ocean is real and potentially inhabited. Galileo burned up in Jupiter's atmosphere and was gone, but everything it found stayed behind in the data, and it was that data that would drive the next 20 years of Europa research and eventually lead to the construction and launch of a new spacecraft, one built specifically to go back and look deeper. In October 2024, a rocket launched from Kennedy Space Center in Florida, carrying the most sophisticated planetary science spacecraft NASA has ever sent into the outer solar system. Europa Clipper. The spacecraft is large. With its solar panels fully extended, it stretches about 100 feet from tip to tip, roughly the wingspan of a Boeing 767 commercial airliner. The solar panels have to be that large, because at Jupiter's distance from the Sun, solar energy is about 25 times weaker than at Earth. Clipper needs enormous panels just to generate enough power to run its instruments in deep space. The The spacecraft carries 9 scientific instruments, and each one was chosen to answer a specific piece of the Europa puzzle. A radar instrument will send radio waves directly through the ice shell and listen for the reflections. Ice reflects radio waves differently than liquid water. When the radar signal hits the boundary between solid ice and liquid ocean, it bounces back differently than when it hits solid rock. By analyzing those reflections, scientists will be able to map the thickness of the ice shell across different regions, locate any subsurface lakes hidden in the ice, and potentially identify areas where the ocean comes closest to the surface. A magnetometer will measure the magnetic field near Europa's surface in much finer detail than Galileo could manage. The ocean's saltiness can be estimated from how strongly it disrupts Jupiter's magnetic field. Saltier water conducts electricity better and produces a stronger magnetic response. The magnetometer will tell scientists how salty the ocean is, which tells them something about its chemistry and its history. A mass spectrometer will sample the extremely thin atmosphere and any plume material that rises from the surface. It can identify specific molecules by their mass, distinguishing between water vapor, organic compounds, sulfur compounds, and other materials. If a plume erupts during a flyby, the mass spectrometer will attempt to identify what the ocean is made of. A thermal imaging instrument will map surface temperatures across the moon. Regions where liquid water is close to the surface, or where geological activity is generating heat, will appear warmer than their surroundings. Heat anomalies could mark the locations of subsurface lakes, active fracture zones, or places where the ice shell is unusually thin. Cameras will photograph the surface in much greater resolution than Galileo ever achieved, mapping the chaos terrains, ridges, and fracture systems in fine detail. The 9 instruments together will build a picture of Europa that is orders of magnitude more detailed than anything Galileo could produce. Clipper isn't designed to find life directly. Its instruments can't detect a living organism. What it's designed to do is determine whether the conditions for life exist, where they exist, and where a future lander should go to have the best chance of sampling them. It is a scout, an advance mission, the most important mission humanity has ever sent toward another world's ocean. Europa Clipper won't orbit Europa. That choice was deliberate, and it goes back to the radiation problem. Jupiter's radiation belt is so intense that any spacecraft spending extended time close to Europa would accumulate radiation damage quickly. Electronics degrade. Instruments fail. A spacecraft designed to orbit Europa directly would likely be dead within months. Instead, Clipper will orbit Jupiter in a long elliptical path that brings it close to Europa repeatedly, but then swings it far out from Jupiter before the next approach. During the close passes, the spacecraft is near Europa and its instruments are running at full capacity. During the long arcs away from Jupiter, the spacecraft is in a relatively low radiation environment, giving its electronics a chance to recover and operate safely. The mission plan calls for approximately 49 close flybys of Europa. The distance during those flybys ranges from about 16 miles above the surface to just over 1,600 miles. Each pass lasts only a few hours, but each pass is carefully planned to collect a specific type of data from a specific region. The trajectory of the spacecraft is designed so that consecutive flybys cover different parts of the moon's surface. Over the course of the mission, the cumulative coverage will build up a nearly complete map of Europa from multiple instrument perspectives. The radar instrument needs its signals to bounce straight up and down through the ice to get the clearest picture of the subsurface layers. So the radar is most useful when the spacecraft is flying nearly directly above a specific region, close to the surface, at the right speed. The magnetometer works best during the closest passes, when the spacecraft is deep enough in Europa's magnetic environment to detect the subtle distortions produced by the ocean below. The mass spectrometer is most useful at very low altitudes, where the thin molecular cloud around Europa is densest and the concentration of any material venting from the surface is highest. The lowest planned passes, at around 16 miles above the surface, are specifically designed to maximize mass spectrometer readings. Each flyby is essentially a separate experiment. Scientists plan them years in advance, calculating the exact trajectory needed to position each instrument optimally for the specific measurement they want to make. The 49 Europa flybys will be spread over roughly 4 years. Between Europa flybys, the spacecraft will also make passes over Jupiter's other large moons, including Ganymede and Callisto, adding context about the broader Jupiter system. The total data volume expected from the mission is enormous. Scientists estimate it will take years after the mission ends to fully analyze everything Clipper sends back. And the mission was designed to answer 2 things above all others. Is the ocean real, and how deep does it go? And is the chemical environment around it compatible with life? The first of those has already been answered by Galileo. The ocean is real. Clipper is there for the second question. Europa Clipper's mission team has a specific procedure planned for the possibility of a plume encounter. It begins with the mass spectrometer, which continuously samples the molecular environment as the spacecraft flies through space near Europa. The instrument measures the mass of individual molecules that enter its intake. In the vacuum near Europa's surface, the reading is normally very sparse. A few water molecules, trace amounts of oxygen, maybe a hint of sulfur compounds from the surrounding environment. If a plume is active when Clipper flies through it, those readings will spike. The sudden increase in water vapor and the presence of heavier molecules, things like sodium chloride, organic compounds, or other materials dissolved in the ocean water, will register as a sharp anomaly in the data. The mass spectrometer can distinguish molecules down to specific mass values, which means it can identify the chemical composition of the plume material with significant precision. Organic molecules, the carbon-based compounds that are the chemical building blocks of biology, have specific mass signatures that the instrument can recognize. Molecular hydrogen, which was detected in the Enceladus plumes and was interpreted as evidence of active hydrothermal activity, also has a distinct signature that Clipper would detect. Amino acids, the building blocks of proteins in every living organism on Earth, have mass signatures that would be detectable if present in sufficient concentrations. Let's be clear about what finding amino acids in a Europa plume would mean. Amino acids can form through purely chemical processes without biology. Their presence would not confirm life, but it would confirm that the organic chemistry of the ocean is complex enough to produce the molecular precursors of life, which would be the most significant discovery in planetary science since the conformation of the ocean itself. The radar and thermal imaging instruments also contribute to plume science. If a plume is erupting from a specific location, the ice in that region should show signs of heating. The thermal camera would detect that. The radar would look for a zone of disrupted ice beneath the eruption point, where liquid water came close to the surface. Between the mass spectrometer detecting the plume chemistry, the thermal camera locating the heat anomaly, and the radar imaging the ice structure beneath it, Clipper can build a fairly complete picture of a plume event even from a single flyby. The challenge is timing. Plumes on Europa appear to be intermittent. Whether a plume will be active during any specific Clipper flyby cannot be predicted in advance. But with 49 flybys planned, the probability of at least one coinciding with active plume activity is considered reasonable. Scientists are not counting on it. The mission is designed to succeed with its other instruments, regardless of whether a plume is encountered. But if one is, the data from that flyby could be the most important thing Clipper brings back. Europa Clipper launched in October 2024 and has been traveling through the solar system ever since. By December 2026, it will do something that sounds almost impossible. It will fly past Earth, a spacecraft heading to Jupiter, using Earth as a slingshot. This technique is called a gravity assist, and it's one of the most elegant maneuvers in space navigation. The physics behind it uses a planet's orbital motion to accelerate a spacecraft without burning any additional fuel. Here's how it works. When Clipper approaches Earth, the planet's gravity begins pulling the spacecraft toward it. The spacecraft swings close to Earth, curving around behind the planet relative to Earth's direction of travel around the Sunday. As it does, Earth's own orbital velocity, about 67,000 miles per hour around the Sun, is transferred partially to the spacecraft. The spacecraft exits the flyby moving faster than it entered, having effectively stolen a small amount of momentum from Earth's orbit. The amount of speed gained depends on how close the spacecraft flies to the planet and at what angle. Engineers calculate the precise trajectory months in advance to extract exactly the right amount of velocity boost. For Clipper, the December 2026 Earth flyby will add significant velocity to the spacecraft's trajectory toward Jupiter. Without this assist, reaching Jupiter would require either a much more powerful rocket launch or a much longer travel time, burning more fuel along the way. With the gravity assist, Clipper arrives at Jupiter in April 2030, having spent far less fuel than a direct trajectory would require. That saved fuel means more propellant available for maneuvering once the spacecraft is in the Jupiter system, which directly increases the number of Europa flybys possible during the mission. The Earth flyby will bring Clipper within a few hundred miles of our planet's surface, close enough that amateur astronomers with good telescopes will be able to spot it passing by. For a brief few hours in December 2026, the most important spacecraft humanity has ever built, heading toward the solar system's most promising candidate for extraterrestrial life, will be closer to you than the moon is. Then it will swing past Earth, pick up speed, and head outward into the dark, toward Jupiter, toward Europa, toward whatever is waiting in the ocean under the ice. April 2030. Europa Clipper reaches the Jupiter system after a 5.5-year journey covering roughly 1.8 billion miles. The first task is not flying to Europa. The first task is slowing down. Clipper will arrive traveling at enormous speed relative to Jupiter. Without decelerating, it would fly straight past the planet and continue into deep space. To enter orbit around Jupiter, the spacecraft must fire its main engine in a precisely timed burn to reduce its speed enough for Jupiter's gravity to capture it. This orbital insertion burn is one of the most critical moments of the entire mission. If the engine fires for the wrong duration, or at the wrong angle, or fails entirely, Clipper misses Jupiter orbit and the mission ends. There is no second chance. The burn has to work. If it works, Clipper enters a highly elliptical orbit around Jupiter. The first orbits are large and slow. They take the spacecraft far out from Jupiter and then back in again. During this initial phase, the science team checks all 9 instruments, confirms they are working correctly after the long journey through deep space and the radiation environment of the Jupiter system, and begins calibrating them against the Jupiter system environment. The first Europa flyby is planned within weeks of orbit insertion. This first pass won't be the closest one or the most scientifically targeted one. It's a checkout flyby, an opportunity to see how the instruments perform in the actual Europa environment, as opposed to the laboratory conditions where they were built and tested. The radar instrument will send its first signals through the ice, and scientists will see, for the first time in history, the actual depth profile of Europa's ice shell from orbital measurements. Galileo detected the ocean's existence through magnetic field measurements. Clipper's radar will map where the ice is thick and where it's thin, locate any subsurface lakes, and find the areas where the ocean comes closest to the surface. That first radar map of Europa's ice shell will be the most detailed picture humanity has ever had of the structure sitting between the surface and the ocean below. The thermal camera will take temperature readings across the surface during that first pass. Hotspots, if they exist, will appear immediately. Any region where geological activity is generating heat within or below the ice will stand out against the 260-degree below zero background. For the science team that has spent years designing these instruments, testing them, and waiting, April 2030 is the beginning of the answer to a question that has been building since Galileo's magnetic data came back in the 1990s. What is in that ocean? They will spend the next 4 years finding out. Europa Clipper will tell us what the ocean might contain. But to know for certain, something has to go down there. A lander, a drill, something that crosses that 15-mile barrier of ice and puts an instrument in direct contact with the water below. The engineering challenge is extraordinary. Almost every aspect of it is harder than anything ever attempted in space exploration. Start with the ice itself, 15 miles of it. The Deepwater Horizon oil well, which was the deepest offshore drill hole ever completed, reached about 5.5 miles below the seafloor. The deepest hole ever drilled on Earth is the Kola Super Deep borehole in Russia, which reached about 7.5 miles before the project was abandoned because the rock at that depth was too hot and plastic to drill further. Europa's ice shell is 15 miles thick, in some regions, possibly more, and the drill would have to operate remotely, without human intervention, on a moon hundreds of millions of miles from Earth, where a signal takes up to 48 minutes to travel one way. If something goes wrong, there's no repair crew. The mission computer has to handle every problem autonomously. The cold is a factor. Ice drilling on Earth, like the projects that recovered ancient ice cores from Antarctica, works in a relatively hospitable environment by comparison. Europa's surface temperature of -260 degrees Fahrenheit affects every mechanical and electronic system differently than room temperature conditions. Materials become brittle, lubricants fail. Electronics that work fine in a warm lab can malfunction in extreme cold. The radiation environment adds another layer of complexity. Any lander on Europa's surface is sitting inside Jupiter's radiation belt. A human would receive a lethal dose in 10 minutes. Electronics receive their own form of damage from radiation over extended periods. The lander would need extensive radiation shielding, which adds mass, which makes the mission more expensive and difficult to launch. Power is another problem. At Jupiter's distance from the Sun, solar panels generate roughly 1/25 of what they would on Earth. A drill powerful enough to penetrate 15 miles of ice requires substantial energy. The lander would likely need a nuclear power source, a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, similar to what Voyager, Cassini, and Curiosity used. And then there's contamination again. A drill penetrating through Europa's ice shell would create a direct pathway between the surface and the ocean. Any bacteria on the drill, however small the number, could potentially reach the ocean water. The sterilization requirements for a drill lander would be the most rigorous in the history of spacecraft construction. None of this is impossible. The physics works. The engineering is hard, but not fundamentally beyond reach. Preliminary concepts for Europa landers have been developed. Some involve melting through the ice with a heated probe. Others involve mechanical drilling combined with melting. The most ambitious concepts include a small submarine that would deploy into the ocean once the drill reaches the water and begin exploring. Whether any of these concepts will be funded, built, and launched in the coming decades is an open question. It depends on what Europa Clipper finds. If the ice is thin in the right places, if the ocean chemistry looks promising, if plume samples suggest complex organic chemistry, the argument for a lander becomes compelling. The drill is coming. The question is when. The clean room where Europa Clipper was assembled is one of the most controlled environments on Earth. Temperature and humidity are held constant. The air is filtered to remove particles down to sizes smaller than a single bacterium. Workers who enter wear full-body suits, gloves, face masks, and shoe coverings. Any tool that enters the clean room is sterilized before it goes in. Any component that comes from an outside supplier is inspected and cleaned before assembly. Despite all of that, building a spacecraft that carries zero biological contamination is essentially impossible. Earth is too thoroughly coated in microbial life to build anything on its surface that is completely sterile. The standards NASA uses for planetary protection fall into categories based on the level of risk a mission poses to a target world. Europa, because of its ocean and its potential for life, falls into the highest risk category. Any spacecraft that has more than a 1 in 10,000 chance of contaminating Europa must meet extremely strict cleanliness requirements. For an orbiter like Clipper, which will never touch Europa's surface, the risk is low enough that standard cleanroom assembly meets the requirement. The spacecraft might carry some biological material, but it will never land, so the chance of that material reaching the ocean is considered acceptable. For a lander, the requirements jump dramatically. Every component must be baked at temperatures high enough to kill all known forms of life. Components that can't survive heat treatment must be treated with chemicals or radiation. Every step of assembly must be documented to verify that sterilization was maintained throughout. Even with all of that, some scientists argue it isn't enough, because the most extreme bacteria on Earth, the ones most likely to survive sterilization, are precisely the ones most likely to survive the journey to Europa and potentially the journey through the ice to the ocean. Some researchers have proposed a different approach. Rather than trying to build a lander with zero contamination, build one that is completely sealed so that even if the outer surface carries bacteria, the drill that enters the ice is sterilized by the process itself. One concept uses a thermal drill that melts its way down through the ice. The extreme heat of the melting process would sterilize the drill tip continuously as it descends. Any bacteria on the surface of the drill would be killed before they had a chance to enter the ice. Only the sterile melt water around the advancing drill tip would reach the ocean. The thermal drill concept doesn't solve every contamination problem. The water that flows back up around the drill and the material that the drill pushes aside still needs to be managed. And a drill that melts its way through 15 miles of ice needs to stay powered and functional for years. But it represents a serious attempt to reconcile the contamination requirements with the physical reality of reaching the ocean. The question of how to land on Europa cleanly is, in some ways, as scientifically important as the question of what to look for when you get there. Finding life in Europa's ocean only matters if you can be certain it isn't from Earth. Assume, for a moment, that Europa Clipper's instruments detect complex organic chemistry in a plume sample, or a future lander pulls water from the ocean and finds organisms. Something biological, something that didn't come from Earth. The implications extend far beyond Europa. Europa is not the only ocean moon in the solar system. Enceladus, a moon of Saturn, has an active ocean and erupting plumes that have already been sampled and found to contain organic molecules and molecular hydrogen. The case for habitability at Enceladus is nearly as strong as at Europa. Titan, Saturn's largest moon, has lakes and rivers on its surface. The liquid is not water, but liquid methane and ethane. The chemistry is completely different from anything on Earth. Scientists don't know whether methane-based chemistry can support life, but Titan is the only other body in the solar system besides Earth with stable surface liquid in quantity. Ganymede, Jupiter's largest moon and the largest moon in the solar system, also has a subsurface ocean. So does Callisto, another of Jupiter's large moons. So, possibly, does Dione, another moon of Saturn. So does Pluto. Ocean moons are not rare. As scientists have looked more carefully at the outer solar system, they keep finding them. Bodies where tidal heating, radioactive decay, or remnant formation heat keeps water liquid beneath thick ice shells. If life arose in Europa's ocean, the question becomes immediate. How did it get started? What conditions were required? Were those conditions unique to Europa or present across all these other ocean moons? If life needs the specific combination of tidal heating, saltwater chemistry, and long timescales that Europa offers, then other moons with similar conditions become candidates. Enceladus meets most of those criteria. Ganymede might. Others possibly. If life can arise in a broader range of conditions, then the number of inhabited worlds in just our solar system could be far larger than the one we already know about. And the solar system is one star out of roughly 200 billion stars in the Milky Way. Many of those stars have planets. Many of those planets have moons. Some fraction of those moons are in situations that create subsurface oceans. The number gets large very quickly. Finding life on Europa would not just answer whether we are alone in the solar system, it would fundamentally change the probability calculation for whether intelligent life exists anywhere in the galaxy. If life arises independently, in two separate ocean environments within the same solar system, the evidence for life being common in the universe becomes overwhelming. 2 data points is not a pattern, but in science, going from one confirmed example of life to 2 is the single biggest conceptual jump you can make. 1 could be a unique accident. 2 is a principle. Everything in the previous chapters builds toward the possibility of life. The water, the chemistry, the energy, the time, the examples from Earth's extremophiles, the organic molecules, the plumes. But science requires taking the other possibilities seriously too. What if the ocean is empty? The quiet seafloor hypothesis, supported by research published in early 2026, lays out a scenario where Europa's ocean is habitable in theory, but lifeless in practice. The argument starts with the seafloor. As explored in Chapter 19, some models of Europa's interior suggest the rocky core is too rigid and cold at the bottom to produce hydrothermal vent activity. The pressure from the ocean above compresses the rock into a state where fractures can't form and fluid circulation can't occur. If the seafloor is geologically inert, the ocean loses one of its 2 main energy inputs. The chemical energy delivered from above, through the sinking ice mechanism, remains. But that energy is diluted across the enormous volume of the ocean. A 62-mile deep ocean containing twice the water of Earth's oceans, with no energy concentrated at specific points, is a very sparse environment. Life in Earth's deep-sea vent ecosystems thrives because the energy is concentrated. A hydrothermal vent is a hotspot. Bacteria cluster around it. Density matters for the origin of life, because chemistry that produces the first self-replicating molecules needs those molecules to be in close enough proximity to interact. In a vast, cold, well-mixed ocean with no concentrated energy sources, the probability of the right molecules finding each other and setting off the chain of reactions that leads to self-replication may be too low. There's also a temperature consideration. If the seafloor is cold and geologically inactive, the bulk temperature of the ocean might be much lower than models that include active venting would predict. Colder water slows down chemical reaction rates. The chemistry needed to produce the building blocks of life happens faster in warmer environments. Europa's ocean could be cold, dark, and chemically dilute. An enormous amount of liquid water, completely isolated from sunlight, without significant heat sources, without concentrated chemistry, running at extremely low reaction rates for billions of years. Life might have never started, or it might have started and gone extinct as the energy supply thinned out over geological time, or it might exist at a density so low, a few thousand organisms per cubic mile of water, that it would be virtually undetectable. This scenario doesn't make Europa less interesting scientifically. A cold, quiet, biologically empty ocean is still an extraordinary discovery and would tell scientists enormous amounts about the chemistry of water rock systems in the outer solar system. But it is the genuine alternative to the optimistic picture, and the honest version of the Europa story has to hold both possibilities at the same time, because right now, without data from Clipper and eventually from a lander, neither can be ruled out. The ocean might be full of life. It might be profoundly, completely empty. Both possibilities are real. Both are scientifically significant, and we won't know which one is true until we look. For the entire history of our species, the assumption, never spoken aloud because it never needed to be, was that life was something that happened here, on this planet, in this biosphere, under this particular sun. Every religion, every philosophy, every framework humans have built for understanding their place in existence has been constructed on a foundation of one known example of life. One data point. Earth. Scientists have been asking whether other examples exist since the first person looked at the night sky and wondered what those other lights were. But wondering is not knowing. The question has been open for all of recorded history, and for all of recorded history, the answer has been the same silence. Europa Clipper changes the terms of that silence. For the first time, humanity has sent a machine specifically engineered to answer the question, a machine built with the best instruments our civilization has ever constructed, aimed at the place our best science says is most likely to give us a second data point. If the answer is yes, if there is life in Europa's ocean, the implications arrive in waves. The first wave is scientific. The entire field of biology expands overnight. Life is not an accident of Earth's particular chemistry and history. Life is a process that chemistry arrives at under the right conditions, wherever those conditions exist. The study of biology becomes the study of a universal phenomenon rather than a local one. The second wave is philosophical. Every framework that places humanity at the center of creation or treats life as something special and rare in a largely dead universe requires revision. The universe is not mostly empty in any meaningful sense. It is populated. We are not a miracle. We are one example of something common. The third wave is long-term and harder to define. If life exists in Europa's ocean, it exists in the other ocean moons. It exists around other stars. The universe is full of it. The question of whether we will ever encounter intelligence elsewhere stops being a philosophical curiosity and becomes an engineering problem with a timescale. And if the answer is no, if Europa's ocean is cold and empty and sterile, that silence carries its own weight. It tells us that the conditions for life, even when nearly perfect, are not sufficient on their own. Something else is required, something we don't yet understand. And that unknown becomes the most important question in all of science. Either answer matters, either answer changes us. The spacecraft is already on its way. It left Earth in October 2024, and it will not stop. In December 2026, it will swing past this planet one last time, picking up speed, and continue into the dark. By April 2030, it will reach Jupiter. By the mid-2030s, its data will be back in our hands. 15 miles of ice separate us from a possible answer to the oldest question our species has ever asked. We built a machine to go find out, and it is already gone.